Good morning. So we make this thing work, okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about benthic algae today and modeling, two things that I'm excited about, but I find a lot of people just kind of drift away when I get into this. I'll do my best to keep it exciting. So what's the motivation here? What we want to do is we want to look at these seasonal algae distributions in rivers, longitudinal distributions. And there's a big space-time component of this. What we'd really like to do is assess what happens when you change management actions, operations, take a dam out, things like this, and see what happens at the primary production level. The issue that we're interested in is quantifying that, because this primary production level is not always considered in the broader scheme when we're doing large-scale restoration projects. It gets lost in how much does it cost to take the dam out, how much does it cost to plant trees. We're going to work in the Klamath River Basin this morning. So food web considerations. All of you may be comfortable with this. I am only comfortable with that little piece on the right. And in a very numerical way that's probably not that satisfactory to you, but that's where I'm working, in the modeling realm right over on the side. We're going to use a hydrodynamic model to develop habitat areas, depths, velocity, local conditions, and reach scale conditions, and then water quality, temperature, limiting nutrients, and other elements that might affect algae. I'm going to say right now, we're in the beginning of this, very early in the process, so it's a simple model at this place. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Klamath water quality and nutrient gradients. It'll take me a minute to get into that. A little bit about local diatoms in that system, and then about the model. So the Klamath River starts in Oregon. Let's see if this works. Up here in the top, Upper Klamath Lake is a hypereutrophic lake. It's its own animal. It's really a remarkable system. In the summer, dominated by Aphanizomenon, nitrogen-fixing cyanobacteria. That boosts nitrogen. It actually consumes a lot of nitrogen, but also adds nitrogen to the system in the late fall and winter as that lake pours its season of nutrient and organic matter out. And in the summer, that bloom also creates anoxia, and we get phosphorus released from the sediments, and that becomes a source for the river system. So we'll see that in a second too. We're really going to be talking about an area below Iron Gate Dam. That is the last dam, or the first dam if you're a salmon coming upriver, that you would encounter on the Klamath. And these Iron Gate Dam, Copco 1 and 2, and J.C. Boyle, those are the ones that are currently slated for removal in all the discussions you've heard about the Klamath. We're going to be working downstream of Iron Gate Dam. So I'm going to go through this slide a little bit first, because I just want to make sure we're all on the same page, since we're talking about gradients, and some of these depictions can be a little bit challenging at first. So this is a space, so Iron Gate Dam at the back of the slide, river mile 190 roughly, and so the river is flowing toward you, and the estuary is river mile 6. We have time across the bottom axis here, January to December, and we have concentration for nitrate in this case. Ammonia in this oxygen-rich environment is pretty much non-detect. A lot of nitrification going on. So if I take this graphic and look at it, I have space and time and concentration. If I draw a line through this graph from the back to the front along any date, I get a longitudinal profile. Okay, that's how these piece together. If I draw a line across any location, I get a time series of concentration at Iron Gate Dam. So in 2010, you can look at this and say, wow, something happens to nitrogen in the middle of summer. Because we are nitrogen limited in the upper basin, much of this system is picking up and retaining seasonally nitrogen in Upper Klamath Lake. We don't get a lot coming down the system. What does come down the system is picked up in Copco Reservoir and Iron Gate Reservoir, where we also have large standing crops, typically of things like Aphanizomenon, Anabina, Gloriocystis, and sometimes and microcystis as well. Microcystis doesn't fix nitrogen though. So it's got a lot of phosphorus in the system, and it's consuming all this nitrogen, and so we get this kind of seasonal shadow of nitrogen, and when that comes down into the river and the benthic algae begin to take take this up, it depletes that through time as you move along. So this is January. If we go to the next April here, you can see now that this gradient is much lower. As we start to have primary production in the upper basin, it comes all the way down here. This orange line is the half saturation constant for algae growth that we're using in the model 0.014. So you start running into limitation when your longitudinal concentration gets close to that orange line. You say, what's that orange line in April? That's the Trinity and Salmon rivers coming in, very high quality, low nutrient water in April. After that, and they go to base flow, you see that in July, I'm running almost 180, 170 miles of severe nitrogen limitation in the river. And that affects the diatom distribution. And that affects the food web. And this happens year after year after year after year. It's a very consistent pattern with high winter nutrient concentrations, low summer concentrations, and diminishing downstream. So then you say, well, what about phosphorus? Well, here's a phosphorus picture over here on the far left. This is still 2010 on the top left. You can see in the bottom here, this little pool of blue, that's winter. All those tributaries are coming in below Iron Gate Dam with no phosphorus, and they're really low conditions. When we move into summer and we start seeing a lot of water quality degradation in the upper basin, we start exporting phosphorus from Upper Klamath Lake down the river. There's so much more of that compared to nitrogen. It moves through the system and creates this big, big kind of mountain of phosphorus over here that comes out, and it gets consumed. It does downriver because it's going to also be preferentially taken up by algae, but it never gets to the limiting point. So we're nitrogen limited all the way down the system in the summer months in the Klamath. And what does that mean for the diatom distributions? So these are some of the more prevalent species we see in the system. You've probably heard of many of these or seen them. Any particular rock you pick up may have all of these or most of these species on it. There's a lot of diatoms in the system. But these are the ones we're going to talk about today. They are typically dominant species, eutrophic diatoms, warm water species. So I want to take a minute and look at this as another kind of funky diagram. So what we did is we looked at the nutrient response. Well, actually we looked at the algae distribution first, and we said, well, what's happening here? The first one is Cimbella, and then there's Cochoneus, Diatoma, Epithemia, Navicula, and Nitzschia. So what we have here is the first third of this box is July concentrations. The middle third is August, and the last third is September. So I don't really want to pay attention to this one or this one. I really want to pay attention to these two. We can see that in the upper river, early in the season, I've got a lot of Cochoneus, but when I move later in the season, it drops off and I don't have so much. And in fact, as I move down the river, it completely diminishes. But I see Epithemia come into the game here. It's almost like South America and Africa. If you put them together, they just cover the river. So what is happening here? There's lots of factors. There's light, there's nutrients, there's temperature. But what we're really seeing is nitrogen limitation. What is special about Epithemia? It's an endosymbiont. It's got cyanobacteria inside it. It can it can fix nitrogen via the symbiotic relationship. And so it can occupy low nitrogen waters. And so when the nitrogen gradient shows that diminishing in nitrogen limitation in the system, the other species fall away, and Epithemia steps in and says, I'll do that. It's a great food source, too, for macroinvertebrates and for fish. The concern is that if you have persistent, hard nitrogen limitation, that you're going to get other things showing up. We do see Calothrix in the system. Rivularia appears in the system. So you have blue-green or cyanobacteria that could come into this system as well. We just have no idea what would happen under a different representation. And those would affect the food web. So what we did, this is the worst slide here, I promise I'm not going to go into this, is took the basic algae logic out of what we call production models. An EPA model, a USGS model, any of these big water quality models have these algae submodels in them. We took it out and put it in a spreadsheet. And then we said, well, let's load this up. Let's do an hourly time step. Let's look over a whole year. Let's look over different space and develop through limiting factors and monode kinetics, all the basic stuff. We'll feed water temperature to it, and nutrients and solar radiation, and we'll see what the algae response is to that modeled condition. So we're kind of going sideways here. We're not actually modeling algae in this exercise yet. We're representing conditions, and then we're seeing how the algae respond and see if we can reproduce that with this simple model. So we looked at 4 locations down the system. There's Iron Gate Dam again, at the Shasta River, the Scott River, and downstream about River Mile 130. We're still a long way from the ocean. And the key that we really put in here was, oops, where is it? This, sorry. We turned off, for one of the species, the half saturation coefficient. We said it's 0, no nitrogen limitation. That represents epithemia. That's a warm water species. We have another warm water species. You have a cold water species. You can see these temperature criteria are different. These are the same. And then we saw what would happen when we put this in the model. And so River Mile 190, we see the cold diatom come up early. We see the warm diatom come up later. There's lots of N and P here. There's no problem. We go down to River Mile 176. We still see this. We see less because there's less nutrient in the system at this point, and the river changes character a little bit. We go down further where we start to run into the nitrogen limitation, and we see that, and by the way, in the lower river here, we have a lot of disturbance. So the blue species falls off, and here comes this epithemia surrogate up, and we go down another step, and it's still there. You can see nitrogen limitation on the blue line in the middle is low. All the way through here, we're using the simulation model to produce the temperature trace, hourly temperature trace, and the hourly concentrations and solar radiation for light limitation. While it looks promising, it's really much harder than I envisioned. We have to group the algae together. We put epithemia in with Rhopalodia, which is another nitrogen endosymbiont. We cannot model Cimbella. We cannot model Ulnaria. We cannot do that yet. We can just put these general groups together. But we do see these general groups distribute themselves along the river, which is important as well. One of the things we really found is that we don't have, in any of the production models, the big models right now, density and competition. And what we know is that certain species will simply outcompete. They have a higher growth rate, they have a quicker colonization rate or importation rate, and they will dominate. We don't see this in the large models right now, and the logic that we took out of large models is completely absent, and we need to add that. They are also very life stage specific. There's a whole history of algae production. There's growth, there's maintenance and senescence, and they have different attributes at those different times. We don't have that pinned down, certainly for our model, and we really have pretty basic representations of these groups. One of the last things I want to say here is we felt that we need to have the big model in place so that you can pick up velocities, bed mobilization, disturbance, short and long-term deviations in nutrient concentrations, meteorological conditions, to get at this question. We still have a long way to go. However, I just thought I'd take up Jeanette on her offer to come and share this with you. And I had only 15 minutes, so I had to race through it. But this is where we're at right now. We're still working on it. And I don't know if there are times for any questions. We can, no? Yes?
Maybe one.
Maybe one. Somebody had a low-hanging fruit question. Yes?
Are there soft algae in the river too?
Oh my gosh, everything's in the river. I mean, here you have Cladophora in the main stem. You have epiphytic in the quiet water epiphytes. All diatoms are taking this over. You can find, we were just up there this summer. We found a remarkable number of cyanobacteria. Not giant, blooms or nuisance levels, but in every single slide, you'd find a little bit of different species. It was really fascinating. Very diverse system, very complicated system, but a great system to work on. We're really lucky to be there. So thank you very much.